My name is Christopher Smith, and I have the pleasure of being your host for the next hour, and also the pleasure of being in conversation with Alexander Larman, to whom we extend a very, very warm welcome. Welcome, Alexander, to our festival.
It's
Alexander Alex is an historian and a journalist. He writes on literary and historical matters for many publications, including The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph, The Spectator, and The Critic. He's published 4 books on the subject matter being as follows: The Second Earl of Rochester, The Restoration of the Monarchy, and Byron's Women. And his 4th book, which we will be discussing today, of course, involves both the crown and a woman. It's The Crown in Crisis, Countdown to the Abdication. And it's been written, as his reviewers have commented, with panache, brio, and much interest. And I can vouch for the fact that it is a page-turner. Our guest is also a ghostwriter. However, here he is present and can be seen, and not in any ghostly form. That is our latest eminent contributor online, Alex Larman. I have 2 basic questions for you, which are purely for information, really, for my information, having turned the pages so vigorously. You mentioned one of the things in it about the financial settlement made between the Duke of Windsor and the government. And yet, I'm not quite sure exactly what it was, because the king, the new king, George VI, says, but the fact remains that I was completely misled. Could you just tell us a bit more about that?
First of all, good afternoon, Berwick. I'm so glad to see so many of you, albeit in virtual form. And thank you, Christopher, for that wonderful introduction. I feel the panache and brio are exactly what we all need at the moment. So
yeah.
The next hour or so is going to bring some of that. Yes, I mean, we're going to jump about a bit, I think, chronologically today. So if we look at what happened with the abdication, one of the ways that Edward VIII was quite happy to leave and to go off was if he was going to be given some money, because he was a man who was very interested in all things financial. And one of the things that he was very clear about was that he would not go unless some kind of provision was made for him. However, where he misrepresented himself entirely was that he claimed to his brother Bertie, who was later George VI, that he was a virtual pauper. In fact, because he had had the Duchy of Cornwall from his father, George V, he'd had a huge amount of money and a huge amount of property and land and so on, which made him worth well over £1 million. However, he misrepresented himself as essentially having nothing. So he asked for and got an annual allowance from his brother for £25,000 a year, which, okay, that was nothing like as much as he would have had in other circumstances. But at the time when the average wage was about £200 a year, it was a staggering amount of money. And so ultimately what you can see with Edward is that he was misleading his brother, partly out of fear that he'd be left high and dry with nothing, because Wallis was a very expensive woman and he wasn't somebody who was going to be able to sustain her the style to which she wanted to be accustomed if there wasn't any money. But also I think there was a sense that he didn't know exactly what was going to happen, and so he wanted to make sure that he could get his hands on as much cash as possible. But one of the issues with Edward, which makes things slightly difficult, is that he initially assumed that this money would be voted for by parliamentary grant. But this became very clear that it was not going to work very quickly, because ultimately what was going to happen is that Parliament were never going to allow Wallis Simpson to be subsidised out of a public purse for all perpetuity. So in the end, it'd have to be Bertie or George VI who would end up giving his brother this money out of his own pocket, out of a sovereign grant. But this was phenomenally difficult and phenomenally laden with controversy. And of course, as he said, as you say, he was completely misled, and this was one of the major sources of difficulty between the brothers for the rest of their lives.
That's very kind. The other thing I'd like to ask you now, which is part of, going back to the beginning of the writing of your book, is that you say in the introduction to it that you started out wanting to write a book on Walter Monckton. And that changed into the book that we now have. Could you describe to us, because it's a very interesting process, really, to listen to an author saying how a historian, how he started with one particular point and ended up with another.
Well, obviously, my craft, darlings. But it's always very funny to me whenever I see anyone who starts talking about my craft and my art. Occasionally been known to do it without self-parody that it deserves. What I tried to do initially was my earlier books were set in the 17th and 18th centuries, so they were very different. But what I wanted to do was to have a bit of a shift in my career, because I wanted actually, for several reasons, to move away from the kind of literary biography that I've been doing before, do something more contemporary. So I was looking for a 20th century subject. And the one that occurred to me, first of all, was I was having a conversation with my former agent. He said, have you thought about Walter Monckton? And I hadn't heard of him at that stage, but I did some research into him. There was all these fascinating stories about him, that he was involved in the partition of India, that he had all of these public roles, that he'd served in World War One, that he'd been involved in prosecuting the prostitutes padre, Howard Davidson. And there hadn't been a biography of him for decades. The last one was by C. Montgomery Hyde, and the previous one was by Lord Birkenhead. So I got quite excited about this idea, and I went to the Balliol College archives in Oxford, where Monckton's papers are kept, with a view to doing a book which was going to be purely about Monckton. But as I started to look into Monckton and look into his life, I realised by far the most exciting and dramatic aspect of that life was the abdication. And initially I thought, and I'm sure many of you are thinking this as well, why another book about the abdication crisis? Surely we've seen it all by now. Surely there's been so many books about it. But I thought to myself, first of all, I discovered all of these documents in the Balliol College archives, which really shed a new light on what was going on, the most spectacular of which was this autobiographical account, which was kept in Walter Monckton's papers by a man called George McMahon, who many of you probably won't have heard of, but he was the man who tried to kill Edward VIII in July 1936. That was a fantastic revelation to find that. And so initially I was thinking about doing a book about the abdication from a perspective of Walter Monckton. But I think that any historian or author would agree with me that trying to be too clever in this business has never got anyone anywhere. And so eventually what it occurred to me, after long discussions with my publisher, was to take all the Monckton material and to use that as the basis of a new revisionist account of the abdication crisis, which would be called the Crowning Crisis, in which would look at the abdication from all kinds of different perspectives, which would use all of this new material, including, of course, the stuff about the assassination attempt on Edward VIII. And the idea would be that it was going to be exciting, that it's going to be suspenseful, and it's going to be absolutely revelatory. And hopefully that's what I've done with panache and brio.
When you describe yourself as a revisionist, can you explain a little bit more about your revisionism?
Well, what I tried to do, I mean, there's many characters in my book, and some of them I was more enamoured of than others. Edward VIII is not somebody I had any great fondness for. I can accept that there are things about him which were quite good. I can accept that he was somebody who was charming, and he was able to connect to the ordinary man in a fairly unpretentious and a fairly straightforward way. But I think that as a king, he was absolutely useless. I mean, somebody of complete vacancy when it came to being monarch. It's a blessing for his country that he stood down after 10 months and that his brother took over. So that, I suppose, I've been harsher about Edward than a lot of other critics and a lot of other biographers have been. Wallace I've been more sympathetic towards, because while I can see there are many arguments for her being money grabbing and being somebody who was obsessed by status, I also believe that she was a woman who was in massively over her head, didn't know what she was doing, and ultimately took fear. And actually, if you go back to the letters that she was writing, not just to Edward, but to her family as well, you can see it is not somebody who is purely calculating money and purely looking for more jewellery. It's actually a frightened woman who can't cope with all the media attention, knowing that she's going to be the instigator of this absolutely terrible outrage. So that was the first instance of revisionism. But then I also wanted to bring the book to life, and I wanted to have a panoramic sense of it being everyone from media moguls and press barons to the man on the street. And of course, during my research, I found literally thousands of letters which were written by ordinary people, which have ended up in the Royal Archives in Windsor or the National Archives in Kew. And all of these really gave me a kind of a perspective-eye view of what it was like to be living in 1936, what it was like to be seeing the king about to abdicate. And I mean, my book's not a massively long one, it's 100,000 words, and it could have been double, even treble the length. But what you want ultimately, when you're writing popular history of this nature, is to write something that people can read and enjoy it as if it's a novel. And I was trying very hard to make sure that the average person could sit down, read the book, and not feel the sense that I often feel while I'm reading really dense history of this is heavy going, this is not something that I want to know something about, this is actually just words and facts and verbiage. What I was trying instead to do was to portray the world of Wallace, the world of Edward, and the world of 1936 in a different and hopefully quite exciting way.
Can you explain the other thing that actually jumped off the page, of course, was when you entitled one of your chapters, Make Britain Great Again. And I was fascinated by that because it was, as you say, you're quoting Oswald Mosley, of course. But what fascinates me about that is the whole idea, which I had no idea about the possibility, and this is one of the fascinating things about the constitutional crisis, the whole idea of the King's Party, inverted commas, the King's Party. Could you just expatiate a bit on that? Because that's a very fascinating area, which I'd never come across before.
Well, I found it absolutely fascinating as well. And it's something which it's still quite shadowy because a lot of the people involved in it, for perhaps obvious reasons, didn't leave much of a paper trail. And so while there's lots of things that you can go to the National Archives or the Royal Archives and find absolutely loads of material about, the King's Party, we have to take on trust people like Edward VIII and Lord Beaverbrook, who, as we'll see, are not quite the most reliable of people. But the King's Party essentially was an idea which never quite came to fruition, that if Edward had had to stand down from being king, if he'd had to abdicate against his will, but he'd actually said, do you know what, I don't want to go, then obviously the Stanley Baldwin's government of the day, the coalition government, would have had to resign. And under normal circumstances, Clement Attlee's Labour Party would have taken over, except that Attlee's Labour Party were no more sympathetic towards the idea of Edward as king than Baldwin would have been. So the possibility then arose, this was whipped up by Lord Beaverbrook, that you would have a party which essentially was a mixture of elements within the Conservative Party who wanted to keep the king on the throne at all costs, but also of people such as Oswald Mosley and the BUF and his fascists. And Mosley actually was a great supporter of Edward VIII and his right to remain as king. And at one point in, quite late in the year, he actually led a march of fascists in East London in support of Edward. And he made this speech, and I think you can see it's very contemporary resonance when he ends his by saying, let us go and sweep away by vote of the people those moaning old women at Westminster, and let us make Britain great again. And you think, well, that's quite interesting because demagoguery has not changed very much in the last 80 odd years. And you can see that actually Mosley and Trump and all the rest of them, there's this very strong through line of DNA that once you want to be a populist, populism's never going to change that much.
Can I go on to the populism thing? Because one of the things which everyone keeps mentioning in the book and trying to get on their side are the people. Everyone talks about the people. Baldwin talks about the people and about the nation, and everyone seems to think that they have a particular hotline to what the vast majority of the people of this country think and thought. It's very difficult, I think. Could you explain a bit more? Given the fact that Gallup didn't exist then, how one got some idea of this popular thing. You're saying partly was through letters. Can you write a bit more about that? Because that's fascinating.
Well, Stanley Baldwin believed that he knew what the people wanted. And Lord Rothermere, who was a proprietor of the Daily Mail, thought he knew what the people wanted as well. And Baldwin and Stanley and Lord Beaverbrook were particularly vehemently opposed to one another. And in fact, it's likely that Beaverbrook took Edward VIII's side in the Abdication Crisis because, as he put it, he wants to bugger Baldwin. So you can see that this great tension between two different approaches. You have Baldwin, who was essentially the last of the Victorians, who was this decent, old-fashioned man who believed in duty and integrity, versus Lord Beaverbrook, who was many things, but what he was ultimately was a newspaper man. He believed in the idea of mass communication delivered simply and straightforwardly. And each of them had a different attitude towards the public of Britain. Baldwin believed that people might have just about accepted the idea that Edward would be able to have a relationship with a woman he wasn't married to. But his problem was, as he put it, I believe people will accept fornication, but they will not accept adultery, because Wallace Simpson was married until October 1936 to Ernest Simpson, who was the most famous cuckold in England, as many put it. And he was he was entirely aware of Wallace's behaviour, and in fact, he was off having his own affairs, so it wasn't as if he was just sitting around at home waiting for her to come in. But in terms of people, of the attitude of the people, it was very, very hard to have any great sense of what was going on, because until December 1936, there was nothing in the British press about Edward's affair with Wallace. It was all over the American press and all over the European press, but because Beaverbrook and Rothermere and all the others had essentially organised a kind of omerta, nobody talked about it publicly, which meant that if you were in the highest society, you would have known what was going on because it was going to be constantly discussed. But if you were going to be in a more backward or just basically, if you were going to be somewhere where this was not a common topic of conversation at your breakfast table or your dinner table, you would have found out that the king was about to abdicate because of his love for Wallace Simpson in December 1936. That would have been an absolute thunderbolt. And so what you had in December, in this very short period between the news becoming public and Edward abdicating, was that the people would actually gather in huge numbers around Buckingham Palace in a kind of unfocused but supportive attitude towards Edward VIII. There's always wonderful photographs that I found of these women standing up, holding signs saying, "We want the king, down with Baldwin and the bishops." And so there's a real sense that Edward had supporters like Monckton who were trying to help him, because he decided that he would abdicate. And his view of abdication was ultimately that it would solve all of his problems, but once he'd gone, he could be with Wallace and live happily ever after. But those who wanted to do constitutional matters better knew that that wouldn't be the end of it. And in fact, for 40 years or so after he abdicated, were very difficult and very unhappy ones for precisely that reason. And Churchill, who was his biggest supporter and probably his most influential supporter, was desperate that he didn't abdicate, because he took the attitude that things change, attitudes change. As long as you are king and you remain on the throne, nobody can force you off the throne. So, but what you had essentially was this fascinating constitutional crisis. And we saw it was the king, who, whatever you thought of him, was the anointed monarch, versus Stanley Baldwin and his government. And then you have the newspaper men, you have the vast voice of public opinion. And the three of them together, I think, were quite a toxic and quite an explosive combination.
It's interesting you mentioned with the ladies, one of them said Baldwin and the bishops. And I'd be very interested to look a little bit more at that particular aspect of it, because in the book, you're very clear about the fact that Cosmo Gordon Lang didn't particularly get on with Edward, and Edward didn't get on with him. In fact, you talked about him being shooed out of Belvedere, was it, or wherever it was. And also this remarkable man, Bishop Blunt. Now, at that time, of course, while some people might have been very anti the bishops, they did actually, at that time, represent a significant swathe of the English populace. And at that time, it was very interesting that, of course, the king, as the defender of faith and the supreme governor of not the head, he's never the head, governor of the Church of England, was also, it was also the case that a divorced person could not receive Holy Communion in the Church of England until quite late on, into the 1960s. And women who are divorced could not be members of the Mothers' Union, for instance. We'd think that's scandalous now, but in those days, and certainly in the 1930s, when a vast swathe of the English populace still went to church quite regularly, it was an element which must have weighed on people's thinking. How could the supreme governor of the Church of England, etc., etc.? Could you comment on that?
Well, it's quite interesting because there's two different schools of thought as to why the abdication was an inevitability. One of them, as you say, is simply the religious aspect. That Edward, as you say, he was this figure within the Church of England. He could not have married a divorced woman and upheld the faith. And that, I think, has been that has often been the simplest way of presenting it, that the relationship between Cosmo Lang and Edward was notoriously bad because Edward had no religious faith whatsoever. And unlike many of his family, he was quite open about his absence of religious faith. I mean, he didn't go to church on Sundays. He expressed no desire to take part in any kind of religious ceremony, which meant that his coronation, which was planned for May 1937, would have been an incredibly difficult event because there was no sense of religiosity, no sense of spirituality in Edward whatsoever. He was a decidedly corporeal figure who was interested in the good things of life rather than eternal salvation. And I think that Lang, who was himself quite a complex figure, loathed Edward because he saw the idea that this man was going to be somebody who he had to crown for absolute anathema. So ultimately, on the one hand, yes, I think it is correct to say that Wallis's status as a divorced woman and the fact that Edward wanted to marry a divorced woman made everything exceptionally difficult. But I think that the constitutional crisis lay very simply also in the fact that Edward was bound as a constitutional monarch to accept the advice of his ministers, most notably Baldwin as his prime minister. And if he did not take their advice, then they would have to resign en masse, thus causing a constitutional crisis. So essentially, you've got two different ways of looking at it, both of which I think are equally valid. What I think is quite telling these days is that we concentrate on the constitutional aspects of it because we can understand that. And we would find it very difficult, I think, to go back to 1936 and see the absolute horror with which divorce was treated. But something that I go into at some length in the book, the very odd circumstances of Wallace Simpson's divorce, because I have this document by Edgerton, who was the clerk to Wallace Simpson's solicitor. And it's never before been published, but it's a fascinating story because he basically shows you minute by minute the sheer level of perjury going on in order for her to get divorced, because she was having an affair with Edward. And although she denied it and he denied it, she was having a sexual affair with Edward while she was still a married woman. This in itself would have been sufficient grounds for the petition of divorce against her husband Ernest not to have been granted, because it was seen that if you yourself were adulterous, then adultery could not be taken as a cause for divorce. So that was the first thing. The other thing was that Ernest offered no defence of the allegations against him. And that was extraordinary because usually in a contested divorce case, the party who was taken in adultery would have their reputation destroyed forever. So you would usually put up some kind of defence in court against these allegations. And he refused to do that because it's been widely rumoured that he was being paid a very significant sum of money to step aside and let Edward and Wallis marry. I think that's probably true. I mean, again, what I found fascinating was I had access to the Royal Archives, including some material that's never been made public before. And while you're in the Royal Archives, on the one hand, you see all of these things. I mean, I had access to Alec Harding, Edward's private secretary's memoirs, and absolutely, your eyes pop out at some of the revelations in them.
Yeah.
But you do wonder, and the same goes for the so-called China dossier, which is allegedly an account of Wallis's adventures in China before she met Edward. Have these documents ever existed, or were they destroyed years ago? Because it'd be a wonderful thing for any historian or biographer to find a document which basically says, to Ernest Simpson, you will get £100,000 if you agree to divorce Wallis. Because obviously, that would be a truly scandalous and truly sensational discovery. But I suspect that no such document has ever existed, or if it did, it was destroyed a long time ago.
Could you just go on from that? Because one of the manoeuvrings are quite fascinating. After the divorce has been heard and dealt with, the idea of the morganatic marriage, that was a fascinating way that they thought they might be able to get around it and square the circle and keep the king as king, allow him to marry Mrs. Simpson, and all would be well, except it's a morganatic marriage. Can you just explain that a bit more? Because it's a fascinating area which they went down.
Yes,
some went down.
It's one of those things.
Churchill, yes.
Like so much of my research into the book, it was something that I had no knowledge of before, because morganatic marriages are simply not heard of these days. They haven't been heard of in decades. And even in 1936, this would have been seen as quite the step. A morganatic marriage is essentially, it's colloquially known as a left-handed marriage, and it's a marriage between two people of unequal social rank. What would then happen is that you would get married, but it would be agreed that there would be no inheritance paid to any child of the union. Indeed, that if one of the members of the union was a duke or a duchess or a king, but the child would not inherit the rank. So in other words, it was done so that if the Duke of Westmoreland wants to go and marry his servant girl, he could do that, but there would never be any question of her becoming Duchess of Westmoreland, and their child would have to have this perfectly normal, perfectly mundane life. But the trouble was, this was proposed by Lord Rothermere's son, Esmond Hamsworth. And this was proposed as a means of essentially squaring the circle, as you say, of having a way in which Edward of Wallace could marry, but it wouldn't offend sensibilities. Baldwin was actually quite interested in the idea of a morganatic marriage because he thought this would be a relatively good way of getting rid of a very difficult and very unpleasant situation. So he presented it to his cabinet, and initially it seemed like it would go through. Baldwin went off to have a meeting with Queen Mary to discuss the situation. While he was away, the meeting went a bit wrong because people like Lloyd George stood up and essentially took a very strongly religious view. Because the argument would be that if this was to be allowed, it was essentially have legalised adultery via the back door. And there was a strong feeling that this could not be allowed to happen. And therefore, when Baldwin returned from his meeting, having been absolutely sure that he had set motions in place for morganatic marriage to go through, he found that all these people had now taken a strong moral line. Neville Chamberlain, who'd actually supported for morganatic marriage in a private meeting with Baldwin, said in front of the cabinet that he thought it wouldn't be a moral thing to allow it, which shows you that political hypocrisy was alive and well even then.
Yeah. Going back to the people, I mean, and Harding especially, who is a remarkable man, I think, in many ways, and very straightforward and remarkably outspoken in his letters and so on. And he makes and this is back to the populism thing, he makes this wonderful quote, which I think is a really good one, and to me, maybe sums up what a lot of the popular mood was at the time, if you could ever find it. But he says this: for the English like, and indeed expect to see their leaders' virtues, which they themselves are not always prepared to cultivate. How would you take that? Because could you tell us about Harding? Because he's a fascinating man.
Yes, I mean, just to pick up that last point again, I mean, it's interesting with Boris Johnson because he's the opposite of that. He's a figure in whom we see vices, but we perhaps wouldn't want to cultivate ourselves. But this was supposed to be his great appeal. So we can actually see that in our current situation, we've gone full circle. But no, I mean, in 1936, you would have expected that your leaders and your king, I mean, I think we do still see that about the royal family. I mean, I think we still look at Elizabeth II as somebody who is above the daily concerns of life and who is essentially a flawless and saintly figure. And I think that there was an expectation that Edward would have the accessibility that he had when he was Prince of Wales, that he would have this sense of being the people's king, but also that he would do his job, and that he'd do his job without complaint, that he would go and open Parliament, and that he would go and meet people, and he'd go and host debutante balls and things like that, which he hated doing. But also the idea that he would be this figure who, as king, would be the symbolic repository of hopes and fears of the nation. And of course, that's what his brother, George VI, ended up doing in the Second World War. But Alec Harding was a fascinating figure, and he's somebody who I got into the book more and more as I went on. I really wanted to explore the idea that on the one hand, he was behaving in an absolutely morally unimpeachable way. He was the king's private secretary, but he was a private secretary to the office of the monarch rather than to the man. So when he thought that Edward was behaving in this disgraceful way, and he wrote to him very candidly and very openly to say, you cannot go on like this. I mean, you could see it as an act of treason, which is more or less how I interpreted it, but you could also interpret it as him being absolutely straight down the line, operating in a really moral way. But the fact that Harding got on very, very badly with Tommy Lascelles, who was the assistant private secretary later in the 1930s, and that shows that there was always a tension. And in fact, eventually Harding retired about 6 or 7 years after Edward VIII's reign on the grounds of ill health. But I think, in fact, that he was so disagreeable in a lot of respects, people really didn't get along with him. And it's interesting, actually, because Harding has always been a slightly nowhere man in terms of history. I mean, many people have heard of Tommy Lascelles, not least because of his appearance in The Crown, so beautifully played by Pip Torrens. Harding has always been shadowy. There's not really been a sense of who he is. And I think that's because, in large part, his archive doesn't really exist. It's been kept under lock and key in the Kentish Records Office at the request of his family. So we don't have an awful lot of material about Harding in terms of, I mean, we've got the memoir that's in Windsor Castle, but we haven't had hitherto an opportunity to have a really in-depth material about his thoughts on the abdication and subsequently. However, I'm very pleased to say that the archive is going to be made available as of next year. So hopefully any future books this subject will be using the Harding material for the first time. So that's a really exciting thing to be coming into.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Now, another point which has been raised by reviewers, and there's two points which I will ask you to address. One, of course, is the fact that it was a great constitutional crisis. Now, some people say, tush, it wasn't a great constitutional crisis at all. I think at the time it felt like one anyway, but I mean, what would you say in terms of constitutional history? I think you covered it a bit by the Parliament thing, but can you just...
Well, it's always quite funny when you get reviewed because you never know what critics are going to say.
Mm.
Sometimes you read a review. I mean, Catherine Hughes in The Guardian wrote a review which absolutely 100% understood what I wanted to do in the book, what I was trying to do in her review. I commend it to any of you as an absolute masterclass in how to write 1,200 words of criticism about a book like this. So thank you, Catherine, if you listen to this. But other critics, I mean, I did feel to a greater or lesser extent, didn't quite appreciate some of the things I was trying to do. And of course, in a sense, as a writer, if you haven't managed to convey your message economically enough, that is on you rather than on the critic. I mean, you can't just sit there and say, oh, they didn't understand my work. But in terms of the constitutional crisis and the aspects to which was this the greatest constitutional crisis ever, on the one hand, no, it wasn't, because the monarchy went on. There was no sense of the country being torn apart, except, of course, there was a sense of the country being torn apart, but in a different way. But, I mean, I think for what people don't realise strongly enough is that this wasn't just a crisis of drawing rooms and palaces. This was a crisis that was dragging in everyone in the country. And after it became public knowledge as to what was happening between Edward and Wallace, there's a very real possibility that there wouldn't actually be a monarchy much longer, because if Edward had refused to abdicate, I mean, he was very keen to abdicate, but there are various problems in terms of taking a unilateral decision to abdicate, that if Edward had decided that's what he wanted to do, that he wasn't going to be going anywhere. Alternatively, if Baldwin's government had fallen and had been taken over by Mosley and the fascists with a few discontented Conservative MPs, there's any number of constitutional problems that came very, very close to happening. Because obviously, when you have these issues, it's an incredibly difficult thing to try and deal with. And my intention, while I was writing the book, was to have a really rounded panorama of what was going on amongst these people, because ultimately nobody wants to be reading a book about just a king and just a queen. And not that Wallace was a queen, of course. I mean, it was the fact that she was never even allowed to be known as HRH, which really rankled. And what I was trying to do while I was writing it and researching it was constantly to try to put myself in the perspective of whoever happened to be the protagonist of each chapter, because I was trying to bring in people like Diana and Duff Cooper, who were both very entertaining figures, and Harold Nicholson, the diarist, who I think the word waspish might have been invented for. And what you try and do while they're putting together a panorama is to think, what was it like? I mean, what was it like when you were writing your diary at the end of the day? What was it like when you were writing letters to people? What was it like when you went outside your front door and you saw the man selling the newspaper that had a hysterical headline on it? I mean, what was that actually like from person to person? And what I was trying to do, I suppose, was to come up with an idea of, if I had been alive in 1936 and I'd been, as I am now, a writer, a historian, somebody who's, journalist who makes a living from writing, and somebody who's interested in what's going on around me, what would this have seemed like? Because what's very interesting at the moment is that we are currently, I mean, unfortunately, this is why I'm not speaking to you in person, but behind the confines of a desk, we are going through this very strange and very uncertain time. And none of us know how it's going to pan out. None of us know what is going to happen in terms of our leaving the EU. None of us know what's going to happen about the pandemic and its resolution. But we are around constantly information, and we are around people who are giving their opinions right, left, and centre. And all that we can do is to try and assimilate it and to try and look at it in terms of, do we believe this? Do we believe this person? Do we think that person's accurate? And I think it's the same about 1936, ultimately, that we go back to the Abdication Crisis, and you have to think to yourself, what was going on? What was happening on the 4th of December 1936? All the papers that were pro-Edward would be publishing editorials, which essentially would be saying, Edward must not leave, Edward must stay as king. The papers and magazines that were less warmly disposed towards Edward and Wallace would be publishing editorials saying more or less the opposite. But of course, you can't ask constitutionally to say, you can't just say to the king, you've got to go. Because Stanley Baldwin ended up being somebody who was very important in this regard, because he and Edward had these long series of meetings throughout October, November, and December 1936. And during these meetings, it was very much the case that Baldwin was trying very, very hard not to let Edward resign and not to let him go away. And Edward was determined to abdicate. I mean, resign, abdicate, the two sides of the same coin. Edward was absolutely determined that he had to go. Baldwin was equally determined at first, but he wasn't going to go anywhere. So that tension between the two of them was something that I tried to get across. And actually, I mean, it make a fascinating stage play, because you've got Edward's account of it from his memoirs, which I think is very inaccurate. And you've got Baldwin's account of it, which he wrote in his memoirs and from conversations with his son. And I'm inclined to think that the Baldwin account is a much more accurate one. But who knows? I mean, ultimately, it may be that it's somewhere in between the two. Hi. And we have lost Christopher's sound for a second, but I'm sure it will be back.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you now, Christopher.
Ah, good. Yeah, the last question, we're coming up to the end of a most fascinating conversation, is the question of, which again I thought was totally unfair, really, that in one particular review, which said that tried to diminish the seriousness of it, in that it was simply a sort of a class thing to avoid looking at the real issues which were around at the time, i.e. the start of the Spanish Civil War, the rise of fascism on the continent, etc., etc., which I thought really was a totally, having read your book, I just felt that was, if I may make an opinion, this big, but I'd be interested in your opinion on that particular point.
I know the review very well. It's David Aranovich in the Times, and I was delighted. Yes. I was delighted with the review because I thought it was very, very sympathetic.
Yes.
But what David was doing in his review was he was actually trying, in a sense, to write about a book I hadn't written and had no intention of.
Yes.
Because there's a bit in it which I literally have as a throwaway line when Willie Gallagher, who's a communist MP, stands up in the debate about the abdication. And he says, is all this really to do with the economy? And to me, that was just funny. It's the idea of a communist saying, it's not about the king, it's all about the economy. But Aranovich took issue with it in his review, and he said, why is it funny? Why is this kind of thing laughed at? Surely the economy was much more important than what was going on. That's a perfectly valid argument. It's perfectly valid to say, if in 1936 you have the Spanish Civil War, you have the rise of Hitler, which of course I see is absolutely vital to the narrative that I was portraying. But you can also say, people are dying in hunger, people are trying to fly off to all kinds of countries and so on. Why does the abdication crisis matter? And if you take that attitude, then ultimately you're probably not the ideal reader for the crowning crisis, because if you don't think it's a particularly important or particularly impressive narrative, then no, I can't really try and persuade you otherwise, other than to say, read the book and then we'll have a conversation afterwards. But of course, what I would argue is that in fact, it is not just about the crown and the royal family. It's not just about a very narrow subset of people. It's about all human emotions. It's about love. It's about passion. It's about treachery. It's about betrayal. It's about trust. It's about honour. And it's all about, really, this extraordinary moment in English history where, for a moment, all the certainties that has existed for decades under George V, less so the VII, but mainly under Queen Victoria, of what a king should be, of what the monarchy should be, were all torn up. And for about 5 moments, there was this possibility of what's going to happen next. And as we know, it ended up becoming George VI, who was a much more dutiful king, a much more frightened figure, but somebody who did the job. And when we faced our great adversity in World War II, and he was very much the right man for the job. But I do think that we can go back to 1936 and we can see what happened, and we can think, yeah, that was the closest run thing you could ever have imagined, just as Duke of Wellington said about the Battle of Waterloo.
Thank you very much. Now, Alex, I'm going to now take some questions.
Wonderful, thank you.
And I'll feed them into you.
Great.
Here's the first one, which is from Joyce. How long does it take you to research a book? And what are the difficulties involved in so doing?
Thank you for that question, Joyce. This one took me about a year to research. It wasn't an entirely consistent process, because what I would usually do is just purely research a book, and then sit down with an absolute massive information and try and turn that into a kind of filleted, tight book. This one was slightly different, because what I was trying to do was to fit things around. And sometimes it's about getting access, because the absolute coup for me was being able to have access to the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. And that came very, very late in the process. I mean, I'd actually finished the first draft by the time that I was given the nod to go there and use that material in research. And the book would have been nowhere near as good if I hadn't had that access. But that meant that I was still researching, even while the first draft had been written. And sometimes that can be an incredibly difficult way of writing a book, because sometimes it can actually end up being, you can end up with a sort of Frankenstein's monster of stitched together bits and pieces. But what I tried to do here was to have the spine and the central narrative, and then find all of these stories and find all of these really fascinating ideas and fit them all together. And certainly one thing I was trying to do throughout the book was always to stick to the idea. My guiding principle was make it entertaining, make it so that people want to read the next chapter. Because, I mean, every single chapter ends with a kind of cliffhanger, because I like books, especially historical non-fiction, which reads like it's a novel, because I don't like the kind of books you get to the end of a chapter and think, oh, God. I like books where I get to the end of a chapter and I think, I want to read the next chapter. What's happening? What's going to happen? And this is a story that everybody knows the ending. I mean, there are points while I was writing it, but I was thinking, can I do a sort of Craig Brown counterfactual thing? In which Edward gets to stay king, marries Wallace, and you're reading it, you're thinking, what? And it is quite tempting to go off into sort of off-piste into these moments of absolute, fantasy, but your seriousness has to come back in. And so in terms of research and what I do, I mean, I tend to go to a library or go to an archive and just sit down, get as many documents out as possible, and either photograph them or take notes, and do a very intensive process of that. Then I try and go away and actually, using secondary sources, using biographies and diaries and letters, try and write the thing. And then editing and doing further drafts. Often it's finding further documents, it's going back, it's me. I mean, because I met some people who'd known Edward and Wallace. I mean, one of the best ones, of course, being Philip Ziegler, who was Edward VIII's official biographer. And so sitting down with him and chatting to him is really interesting, because he gave me lots and lots of really useful insights into what Edward was actually like. And you do realise that although these events were 80-odd years ago, they're very much in living memory for a lot of people. I mean, both my grandmothers, who unfortunately passed away while I was writing the book, they could both remember what it was like to be around in the abdication. And so that gave me, as I was saying a moment ago, the kind of the on-the-street view as to what it was like. When you can be asking people, what was it like? What were these people like? And they can say, well, it's like this, it's like that. Your task is infinitely easier. Thank you for an excellent question.
Now, the next excellent question, and if we've got time for a few more, is one from Sue, which is basically just about what you felt about, you mentioned, you touched on this already, and you touched about in quotations a lot in the book, what you felt about Edward's character. Could you go into a little more detail about that? There's lots and lots of quotes in the book, which is, as I say, it's a page turner, your book. I loved it. What's his character, his weaknesses, his flaws, his strengths, and so on?
Well, first of all, thanks for your excellent questions, Sue. I'm hoping that all the questions are going to be as good as these two. I'm going to have a very fun afternoon if they are. So what I try to do in the Crowning Crisis is, I mean, I studied literature at university. English has always been an absolute passion of mine. And I tried to look at this in Shakespearean terms. You know, Henry IV Part 2 was a particular lodestone for me, because obviously in that we have the narrative of the young Prince Hal giving up his wild, rakish past and assuming responsibility when he becomes King Henry V. And what was quite clear to me was that Edward VIII was not Henry V. He was not somebody who came into integrity and to honour as he became king. He was this sort of strange combination, actually, almost of a Falstaffian figure, and then almost of a kind of one of these Macbeth-like types of somebody who doesn't quite make it, who even if they become king, doesn't have the moral stature to fill into it. But what's always interesting, and you know, we touched on this in the last question, and we can touch on this further, is that when you are writing a book like this, it's a bit like writing a novel, because you have your opinion of the characters you're writing about. And then, in fact, every single book that I've written about somebody, I've been surprised by what people have thought of them, because I wrote a book about Lord Rochester, who was a kind of satanic libertine, and I tried to portray him as this kind of satanic libertine. And the critics, to a man or woman, said I was very sympathetic towards him, and that I tried to reinvent him, and I thought, wasn't expecting that one. And then a book about Byron, in which I tried to be completely balanced and completely straightforward. What ended up happening was that everybody thought I'd condemned him and I put the boot in. This is an absolute low point at the Byron Society's Christmas dinner that year, when the Lord Byron himself, the very still Lord Byron, stood up, castigated me for my liberal and anachronistic attitudes. And I thought, thanks for that, Byron. What I found with this one was that I thought I'd been quite scathing towards Edward VIII, and I actually explicitly at the end of the book list all of his failings and list all his while my wife was reading it, she said, I quite like him. He's quite fun. He's got all the best lines. You make him seem like quite an engaging figure. And I thought, well, I hadn't intended any of that. But I suppose that he is, you know, he does have these witty moments, and he does have this debonair quality to him. And so I suppose that ultimately he was very, very popular amongst his people. He was somebody who, I think more so than any ruler before or since, he had the common touch. And in a lot of respects, he was happiest when he was around people who, especially people who served in the armed forces, because then I think there was a sense of man-to-man fellowship. There was a sense that he could be amongst people who he could talk to on essentially an equal level. And it's interesting that all of his love affairs before Wallace were with people from high society, but by no stretch of imagination, people who ever had wives for him. And I suppose this common touch was what led him to Wallace ultimately, that he wasn't interested in the idea that his people who he'd be associating with were going to be royalty or dukes and duchesses. He was more interested in hanging around with people like Johnny Mullen, who's the editor of Vogue. So yes, I mean, from that perspective, you can see that he was this accessible figure who people liked and who people could respond to. But you can also see that he was incredibly selfish. He was incredibly self-absorbed. I mean, he genuinely didn't believe in anyone mattering apart from Wallace. And in fact, they had this name for each other, W.E. This was held up as the absolute unbreakable sign that W.E. were the ones who could overcome everything. And I think that a psychological portrait of Edward was a difficult one to portray. And as I said, I'm very interested that people have taken his side or not taken his side. But if I was to write a future book on this subject, which I hope I will be doing, then we can get into Edward's Nazi sympathies more fully there, because I think that is something which I touch on them in this book insofar as very relevant. But I think that as the Second World War loomed, that complicated the issue quite dramatically.
In fact, there's just been a question about that, Alex. If he had remained king, it's just come through from Geraldine. Before you actually said that, if he had remained king, what effect might that have had upon our stance with regard to Hitler and his rise in Germany and things like the Sudetenland, etc.?
It's a very, very hard one to say for certain, because Edward was... To call Edward a Nazi is, I think, somewhat inaccurate, but to say he had Nazi sympathies is 100% accurate. So obviously Edward came from a German background himself. I mean, he had cousins such as the Duke of Saxe-Coburg who were German. And he had great sympathy for the Germans because he saw Hitler as a vigorous reformer and somebody who had taken his country out of his dire situation it was in after World War I and made it this leading European power. He responded to all of that, and he responded to Hitler's energy and Hitler's vision. What I think would have happened if he had remained king is that he would have very much been at the forefront of the appeasement movement. And he would have been somebody who was trying very, very hard to lean on whoever was prime minister, whether it was Baldwin or Chamberlain or anyone else, may well have been Churchill, of course, who was and of course, Edward and Churchill were very close. But I suspect that what would have really driven them apart was the fact that Churchill, even in 1936, was very much somebody who could see the danger that Hitler was posing and was vigorously, saying to people, danger gathers upon our path. We cannot be complacent. And I mean, it's fascinating because that, to me, when I found that he said that at the end of this debate after Edward's abdication debate, it's almost like you're teeing up the next story. The danger is gathering upon the path. And Edward was somebody who I think was blind to that danger. And I think that, what was fascinating was even in later life, he would say, I never thought that Hitler was such a bad chap. And you think, okay, well, I think your judgment of what being a good or a bad chap is not the one that you could perhaps trust the most fully. But I think that ultimately you can see Edward and you can see that, something I'm actually quite interested in exploring more is Wallace's Nazi sympathies, because her political views, such as they were quite liberal. I mean, Lord Beaverbrook had dinner with her many occasions, and he said she expressed liberal, sensible, well-rounded opinions. So the idea that when she was in Germany in 1937 with Hitler and standing side by side with him, you have to ask, was she hating every second of it? Was she perfectly happy to go along with it? Or had she actually found in Hitler somebody that she thought, oh, I admire him, I like him? So it's an interesting question.
Going back to a previous thing where you were talking about being accused of reinventing people, and you've almost started to answer it. Jackie has asked, who are you going to reinvent next?
Well, I mean, Jackie, thanks for that question. I don't want to jinx my next book because obviously it has to be formally commissioned first. I don't want my publisher, if they're watching this, to think I've jumped the gun. But given that the book has been thankfully quite successful, I think that hopefully it should all be sorted out relatively soon. And what I would like to do next is to explore essentially the next 10 years of what happens in the House of Windsor. I'd like to be able to look at the future lives of Edward and Wallace, but also what happened with George VI as king, because there's so much material that hasn't been brought into the public domain yet. There's this fascinating dynamic between the two brothers, which I touch on in this book, but the full horror of it, I think, in places has never really been properly told. And actually, the Walter Monckton archive at Balliol has all of this fascinating material, which I would hope to use in a future book like that. But in terms of people who aren't in the royal family, or even people who are, I mean, every writer likes to think they've got a 5-year plan, but in my case, I think I've got a 20-year plan of people that you would like to write about. And occasionally I do sit down and I see a book written, I think, oh God, I wish I'd done that. I mean, writer Matthew Sturgis wrote an excellent book about Oscar Wilde a couple of years ago, and I've always wanted to write about Oscar Wilde because I think there's a lot to be said about him that hasn't really been done. I want to write about David Bowie for a long time because, again, I think he's somebody who you could do a really interesting examination of David Bowie's psyche and in terms of his influence, and look at him as if he was a kind of cultural, artistic figure, not just a musician, and so on and so on. But ultimately, I'm somebody who's always tried to write about a variety of interesting people. I mean, you try and like the people that you write about. It's not always possible. And in fact, there are times with Lord Byron, when I was writing about his mistreatment of his children, I was hating him so much that I thought, this is almost an ordeal to write this book. Can I just say to the publisher, actually, I don't want to write this anymore? But then, I mean, I think that, I can't remember who it was who said it, but the biographer has to have a slice of ice in their heart. You have to be able to leave your personal opinions and your personal feelings about people you're writing about at the door. Of course, if you choose to let them in the door, that can be very entertaining, both for the writer and hopefully for the reader. But you've also got to be dispassionate. You've also got to look at these people and look at what they were doing. You've got to be quite cold. And I think that's always got one of the interesting things when you think about your subjects, because, as I said at the start of the talk, I hadn't planned to write a biography of Walter Monckton. he wasn't somebody who I knew anything about a few years ago. So the fact that the crowning crisis is a testament to that, it shows that these things do change.
Can I a final question from Kevin, and then we'll have to wind our session up, which has been fascinating. And that is, people talked a lot about the empire. How do you think the empire viewed the whole constitutional crisis and Edward and Wallace? Big question.
Excellent question, Kevin. And in fact, you are mirroring a question that my former agent asked me when I handed in the manuscript. He said, well, I enjoyed it, but where are the dominions? And the answer is that if I'd had 150,000 words, what I would have loved to have explored in those 50,000 words was the relationship that Edward had with places like Canada and India, which were the traditional dominions, because one of the quirks of the abdication was that you could only abdicate if there was consent given by all of your dominions. But if Canada or India or anyone like that had actually vetoed it, he wouldn't have been allowed to abdicate. But obviously the government were very clever. They managed to phrase the question asked to all of the dominions in such a way that it was inevitable that consent would be given. And actually somebody that I would have loved to get in the book, but it simply wasn't space, was John Buchan, who of course, the great novelist, who was Governor General of Canada at the time. And he was one of the people involved in actually essentially making the decision to allow his king to abdicate. And it's a fascinating story, and it's one that I think there's probably another really good book to be written purely on this subject, but you take away all of the national stuff and go into the international stuff. But something that I'm also very interested in, and any biographer of Monckton, I'm sure, will get into this in more detail, is the fall of empire. Because obviously in 1936, you are watching the end of empire, you're watching the sun setting on the Raj and all the rest of it. And there's very much a sense that there is this status quo which is going to end in the next few years, which of course it did. And so, yes, I think that Edward called himself emperor, but that was as hollow as, as hollow as the jewels he gave Wallace, you might say.
Thank you very much, Alexander. We've now come to the end of the session. We're going to have a few practical points, housekeeping points first, before we actually finally end it. But just to remind you that you can purchase the book at all good booksellers, and also at our good bookseller, Greaves, in Berwick, if you live around Berwick or the borders. It's published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson. And now it leaves me nothing else to do but the best thing of all, and that is with great pleasure to thank you all, the audience, for being with us, and especially a very, very special thank you to our speaker and writer of this excellent book, this page turner, to Alex Larman. Thank you very much, Alex. It's been a joy to have a conversation with you and to share your views and the process of what you've produced, this page turning book of very profound thoughts with us all today. So many thanks indeed.
It was my absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.